Okay, so this is a presentation where I'm trying to really integrate evolutionary anthropological knowledge into a framework for understanding the global brain in an evolutionary context. For me, I come from a background in evolutionary anthropology, but I've always felt like I've been torn between two intellectual worlds in a sense, because I have yet to read an evolutionary anthropologist to really discuss these ideas or take them seriously at any length. So in a sense, I'm trying to bring these worlds together that I feel I've been torn between for most of my career. I wanted to start with this quote: "Biological intelligence is a fleeting phase in the evolution of the universe." That's by Paul Davies. It could mean a number of things. For me, I interpret this to mean whatever the global brain is, it's an emergence of computer networks. And it might be humans that are building this computer network, but it itself is not biological in nature. And however we interpret biological intelligence, from the rise of our genus, or if we want to use it as a metric for the rise of civilization, we've been around for a very brief period of time when compared to the history of life on the planet. So biological intelligence itself seems to be very fleeting. Of course, it's just one example of biological intelligence, but I feel like it fits for the theme of this talk. So the pathway for today, these are basically the three things I want to be covering. A theory of human metasystem transitions, where I'm going to be talking about three periods in human history where we've released new energy into our system, we've exploited a new energy source. Hunting, agriculture, and industry. And so what I feel is in each of these transitions, there's a new pattern, there's a pattern to each of them. New energy and communication, and the pattern includes energy, communication, and transportation. Energy and communication in sort of a feedback loop, with transportation emerging from it, and the timing and diffusion patterns of these transitions are something I'm going to go into. And then with each of these transitions, they essentially work as restructuring mechanisms for our society. And then implications that I think we can draw from this, from the global brain. I'll go into each of these things in greater detail. So metasystem transitions themselves, this is something that probably most people in this room are aware of. A lot of research on metasystem transitions has come out of this institute, but they're essentially how systems achieve higher level order. And what I wanted to emphasize with research that's been done on metasystem transitions is that the human system shares the same patterns that we see that other metasystem transitions occur in other areas of nature. So from non-life to life, from unicellular life to multicellular life, the same patterns: smaller entities forming larger entities and then differentiating. The smaller entities, once the metasystem transitions has occurred, being unable to reproduce in the absence of the larger entity, and then smaller entities in the larger entity being able to disrupt the larger entity itself. These are all things that our system shares, patterns that our system shares. Oh, so for example, in the same way that a cancerous cell can disrupt the human body, smaller agents in our system, like terrorists, for example, could disrupt the larger system, the nation state, or so on. And that metasystem transitions are sort of like discrete jumps or quantums of evolution. I view them, in a sense, in our system as punctuated equilibrium like bursts, with all the rest of the change that occurs in our system being more akin to something like phyletic gradualism. So the human system. So as I say, new order and control have been achieved three times with hunting, agriculture, and industry. And what's connected, what all of these things share, why they're named after these three things, is that they have exploited a new energy source. With the first one, meat; second one, domestication of plants and animals; the third one, fossil fuels. And what's interesting is that while these new energy sources have been exploited, a new communication medium has co-evolved with the exploitation of the new energy source. With the first one, it was language; second one, writing; and the third one, the printing press. And there's some interesting patterns in terms of how the communication medium and the new energy source feed off of one another. It's something that I'm going to talk about a little bit more, but there's an interesting relationship between them. And then it's always the case that the new transportation or agent networks, as I'm calling them, form after the new energy has been exploited, never before. It's always the effect, never the cause. So after we exploited the new energy resources of hunting, our agent networks expanded to become regional, and then with agriculture, continental, and then with industry, intercontinental. And I feel like the next jump will be a completely global system. So to start off with energy, our closest living relatives and then pre-Homo hominids never exploited meat to a high degree. So we have the great apes, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans. They're basically frugivores or frugivorous. Chimps being the only outlier in this, and they only consume about 3% of their annual energy from meat. It's not from lack of desire to eat meat. They would like to eat more meat. They're just very bad at it in compared to hunters and gatherers and modern humans.
Does that include insects?
That does not include insects. That does not include insects. And then with gorillas and bonobos, they don't really hunt at all. Interesting thing with chimps is that they do design technology to hunt small mammals. It depends on the population how much meat they consume. Overall, though, it's usually the adult males that consume most of the meat because they're the ones hunting, and they might use that extra energy to gain reproductive advantages over other males by sharing it with females or even sometimes their kid. But gorillas and bonobos don't eat meat at all. For the most part, there are some populations that have never been observed to eat meat. It's arguable whether they've ever been observed to actually hunt or construct tool technologies to hunt. And then we have pre-Homo hominids, so this would include the Australopithecines, Paranthropus, and Sahelanthropus. And depending on if you're talking to a lumper or a splitter, there's a few other genuses. But basically, there are two main broad dietary shifts that occurred in pre-Homo, none of which included meat. So the first pre-Homos that lived in between 7 and 4 million years ago had diets similar to extant great apes. They were living in similar environments. They were basically frugivores and frugivorous. And then 4 to 2 million years ago, there was a dietary shift. We think that the African environment changed a great deal. They moved on to woodlands and savannas, and they started to have a diet much more akin to something that you'd expect of gelada baboons, where they're eating grasses, sedges, and bark. But at no point in the archaeological record do we see them ever exploiting meat.
What's a sedge?
Sorry? Sedges are like a plant type that grows on savannas. And yeah, so but at no point in the archaeological record do we see evidence, nor in their what we can tell from their dental remains, are they exploiting meat at all. And that changes with hunting. So we see this as soon as the genus Homo emerges. One of the most interesting sites is at a recently discovered site from a publication in 2010, East Turkana in Kenya, where we have the first, and I've included the work cited at the end. You guys can go if you're interested in reading any of these publications. But what we see is the first examples of mass exploitation of small animals as well as aquatic resources. There are turtles, there are even scavenged crocodile remains, there's evidence of even fishing. And this is really early in the emergence of the genus Homo. And so this was a surprise. It was, of course, dependent on region, so not all Homo habilis populations were consuming meat, but the point is that overall, the percentage of meat they were consuming had started to increase, and there was more a regular part of their diet.
How do they measure the amounts? Is that on the basis of proteins in the remains? Or?
Yeah, both from dental remains. Basically, you can tell from isotopic ratios what they're consuming, and also from the site themselves. If there's animal remains around their area and that it shows cut marks or scavenging marks, you can sort of tell by the cut marks whether they were hunted or whether they were scavenged.
Yeah, but it's difficult to estimate which percentage can become.
Right. So actually, we don't know the percentage for Homo habilis. My point is with Homo habilis is that we overall, there's a small increase in the amount of animal meat they're consuming compared to the Australopithecines. And this is just the very start of the transition. So Homo habilis, in terms of its meat consumption, would have paled in comparison to the amount of meat that Homo erectus started to consume later in human evolution, as we'll see. So we get a substantial increase in meat over the course of 1.7 million years to 200,000 years. This comes immediately with the control of fire. So this is key. 1.7 million years ago is around the time where we see evidence that Homo erectus emerged and started to control fire. I'm pretty sure that control of fire's first cause was increased animal meat consumption. We know from ethological studies of animal behavior that the first technologies that animals start using are related to food consumption. And we see that the first fire pits also contain a lot of animal remains around the hearth. We also see with Homo erectus a quite dramatic increase in body and brain size. It's estimated that their brain size was 50% larger and their body size was about 40 to 50% larger than the Australopithecines. And of course, their ranges were substantially larger, and it's been estimated that they would have needed about 40 to 50% more energy, their total energy expenditure, than would the Australopithecines, just based on their brain size, their body size, and the amount of range they were covering. So they would have had to have fueled this in some way. It makes sense that animal meat was the way they were doing it. This is in correlation with their remains at different sites throughout East Africa and Eurasia, and their complex technoculture starts to emerge here. Basically, this is a concept of the ratchet that was introduced by psychologist Michael Tomasello, who proposes that the real difference between our technology and our culture, in comparison to the rest of the animal kingdom, is that it's ratcheting in its nature, and it's multi-step. So there's several steps to the construction of our technology in comparison to all other animal technology, which is one step, and it's not passed on very faithfully from generation to generation. We start to pass it on very faithfully, and it starts to get ratcheting in its complexity. There are 4 steps, 5 steps, 6 steps in terms of the construction.
You mean
of the
that new generations build
build on the
older
previous
generations and
add to it, yeah. It's ratcheting in its nature, that's what that means. And so each of these transitions deserve really an hour discussion on their own, but the main point is that after this transition, and we see different species come and essentially ratchet up the amount of animal meat that's being consumed. The main point, though, is that by the emergence of modern hunter-gatherers, about 45 to 65% of their energy is coming from animal meat. This is a massive jump, obviously, from the Australopithecines, which weren't consuming any meat at all. Humans started, as soon as the genus Homo emerged, we started exploiting animal meat. We started doing it at an increased rate, and we see massive changes. And so it's hypothesized that this exploitation of animal meat co-evolved in a feedback loop with the emergence of language. So the most interesting research, or the most interesting researchers who have been doing work on this, is actually Robin Dunbar, who's come up with a model for the emergence of language that correlates neocortex size and primate group size. From this model, he's extrapolated that language emerged in 3 or 4 main movements, in Homo erectus, Heidelbergensis, and Homo sapiens. And so this would also be correlated with the amount of meat they were consuming. And it's hypothesized that with primates, grooming is really the mechanism that they use to keep group cohesion. And they basically live in groups of maximum 40 to 60 individuals. But with with the emergence of the genus Homo, they would have needed a better communication mechanism to keep the group together, and so it's hypothesized that grooming with these 3 or 4 main movements, with each step going closer and closer to vocal languages as the bonding mechanism to keep the groups together. The first movement would have included grooming with vocalizations, and then it would steadily have progressed to more and more vocalizations, with the main function of that being to keep the social group together. And then with language, you would have the emergence of a culture code or a symbolic code. Something that is important with this is that this would support really the stabilization of the ratchet itself. So you would need symbols to keep complex technoculture, to faithfully transmit complex technology over a course of generations and generations, and language would be a good mechanism which to do that. You also get important shifts in the types of thinking that you would be able to do. So from percept thinking to concept-based thinking, you would start to apply symbols to concepts, and it would just change the way you were thinking about the world.
Logan that you're referring to?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh yeah, because
Yeah.
he's also industry collaborating with the GBI.
I actually had a chance to speak to Logan about that after he suggested I met up with him and was discussing his thoughts on the shift from percept-based to concept-based thinking. But essentially, I think one of the, apart from the correlations between neocortex size and group size, which are really strong in terms of their ability to predict what type of communication mechanism you would need to stabilize a group of 150 to 200 individuals in a primate species, it's really the evidence for complex culture that I'm convinced by, where we get these bursts of increasingly complex culture with each of these species, from Homo erectus to Heidelbergensis to Homo sapiens. And the only way you could possibly continue this ratcheting type of culture is to have some sort of symbolic communication mechanism with which to transfer this complex culture on from generation to generation to generation. So if it did go in these waves, then we would see this steady ratcheting up of transition to language with the increased consumption of animal meat. And then transportation. So what I'm calling transportation, it's a number of things, but really what I'm talking about is the absolute group size that can be stabilized with the communication mechanism and the new energy, and the range at which they are controlling the agents in the system. So with group size, it increases from about chimpanzee group size, which would have been about 50. Really, their party sizes are about 10. And then it, on an exponential growth chart, up to 200, in between 150 and 250 to early human hunter-gatherer group sizes. Of course, the mechanism would have been grooming to language. Basically, the rationale for this is that if grooming remained the mechanism for a species like Homo heidelbergensis based on their neocortex size, they would have basically had to spend their entire day grooming each other to maintain the cohesion of a 150 to 250 member group. It would have had to be a more, with language, you get the ability to keep a group together. You can groom 5, 10, 20 people at the same time by having conversations with them, keeping the whole group together. With range expansion, these seem to have come in two different waves. As soon as the emergence of Homo erectus, they basically explode into Asia. This happens at an astonishingly quick pace in the archaeological record. And what we see from the tools they're making is that their ranges increase to about 20 kilometers, so the range with which they're getting the resources with which to make their tools expand. But they're still restricted to temperate climates, so we don't see them in Siberia. We don't.
By range, you mean how far they get in one day?
No, by like just the range they must have been controlling, or like their territory.
Uh-huh.
So like their camp or something like that, and their range with they're moving about and getting resources for themselves. But they're restricted to temperate climates. We don't see them in cold climates. We still see them in lower tropical climates in Asia, India, Southeast Asia, South China. But then this changes again with another wave of transportation around 500,000 to 100,000 years ago, where they get larger ranges, 100 plus kilometers in size, in which they're getting the resources from larger areas, and basically they can live in all environments. Homo heidelbergensis, Homo neanderthalensis, these species are existing in very cold climates, and then eventually with the emergence of Homo sapiens, they just can basically exist in almost any climate. We colonized every available landmass on the planet in a relatively short period of time, everywhere from the northern Arctic to the southern tip of South America. And this comes after exploitation of energy and the new communication mechanism, not before. So then with agriculture, we don't see much change until the emergence of agriculture again. We get new energy. There are 7 independent centers, 3 in Eurasia, the Fertile Crescent, East Asia, and New Guinea. With the Americas, we have exploitation in Central America, Northeast North America, Northern South America, and in Africa, I think it's a region of West Africa, but it's debated. And all to different degrees. But what's important here, I think, which is interesting from a metasystem transition analysis, is that the same system-level patterns emerge, regardless of culture, regardless of region. It basically happened in the same order. The same ordering events occurred. So first, the cultivation of plants, followed by the domestication of large animals, then full farming with sedentary complex villages. And always in this order, it never breaks from this pattern. There are obviously some centers that don't intensify their agricultural production as much as others. The Fertile Crescent in East Asia had the most intensified version of agriculture than other regions, but the same pattern emerges, and then proto-writing to writing. And then the intensification was just dependent on the crop complexes available to them in their continental areas, and the richness of the complexes was in descending order: Eurasia, Americas, Africa, Australia. And the Australians didn't even experiment really with agricultural production because they didn't have the plant and animal complexes which to do it.
You mean the intensity is the complexity of the combination of crops and animals? The more crops and animal species they had available, the more intense.
Yeah, the more intense it would become.
Yeah.
The more energy would be released into the system. It just depended on the animals they had available to them. Right? And a great example of this is, I think Jared Diamond was saying in one of his books about the emergence of agriculture, is that try domesticating a lion or a hippopotamus or a giraffe. These are animals in Africa you just can't domesticate it. Africans didn't have the animal. They didn't have horses and cows and pigs, and these are things that we're lucky enough to be in Eurasia, on the Eurasian continent. And then diffusion was just dependent on the climate and axes and then neighboring systems. So with the east to west axis of Eurasia, it diffused very quickly and readily. The Fertile Crescent core diffused to Europe, to India, to North Africa. The East Asian core diffused to Northern Asia, Southern Asia, and then the islands. And when neighboring systems collided, they would usually fuse their agricultural crops. They would just enrich each other. So I'm pretty sure pigs came from the East Asian system and became integrated into the Fertile Crescent system. When the East Asian system collided with the New Guinea system, which wasn't as intensified as the East Asian system, the New Guinea system was enriched, but also the East Asian system was enriched. They got taros and yams and stuff like that. And so they would enrich each other, and if a core didn't come into contact with your region, you would continue hunting and gathering. And then, so very interesting is the research on writing over the last 10 years that's happened, is that there are 4 independent writing centers. These 4 independent writing centers are all emergent in the most intensified agricultural cores. So there's not an outlier in that respect. So Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and Central America were all the 4 cores where agriculture was exploited to the highest degree, where the most energy was released, where the most complex civilizations were arising. I would like to add that the Aztecs and the Incas both had a communication system to stabilize the empires that they built. Why they're not included by most archaeologists in the list of writing cores as independent is because those writing systems never matured into full writing, which would be writing that completely mirrors narrative and spoken language. They were just systems that were used in organization of crops, organization of perhaps political alliances, but they weren't writing stories. There weren't any narratives in their writing system. So this is why they're not really included in the 4 independent writing centers. But in fairness to the Incas, we haven't really decoded their system, so we don't know that to that degree, right? Like the Khipu's not really, it's not really well understood what information has been encoded in that. There's no Rosetta Stone for it. But the key is that with all these writing systems, the first writing that emerges in all of them is related to organization, administration of taxes and trade. This is not for stories. This is not for religion, not for science, not for. It's for taxes. It's for keeping track of your stock, your I guess keeping track of farming inventory over the years, perhaps, or basically for taxes and trade. And making lists of this stuff. This is what the first writing was. And then there was a gradual evolution of this over centuries and millennia. It's not really quite sure how the transition goes from writing that's in the form of administration, taxes, and trade to something that's fully exploiting spoken language and reflecting narrative and thought. But I'm pretty sure it's related to, my hypothesis, I guess, is that the more energy that's being released in the system, the more individuals in the system you have that can be non-food specialists. So you can actually have people that are dedicating their time to writing about history, perhaps, or teaching other people, and then you then need a functional use for writing that's not related to just these lists of taxes and trade. You might need a type of linguistic system that has an alphabet where you can faithfully transmit what you think about the world. But this occurs over centuries and millennia. It doesn't happen very, very quickly. So the point is that when it does eventually emerge, is that the alphabet that emerges brings speech and writing together. So you have an investment in narration, and you get. We'll talk about more about what this means later on, but that's, I think, the importance of it. And then again, transportation emerges once you've got the new energy, once you've got the new communication mechanism to stabilize the new level of order. You get civilizations with as many as 10 to 100 million agents. I talk about two outliers that I found with this, but basically most civilizations, large civilizations, would have been at 10 and 100 million. Of course, most agricultural civilizations would have been well below this, but that would be the maximum. The reason is related to something I'll talk about, but the mechanisms for this were the energy communication examples. I wanted to talk about three aspects of this, though, is that there are gradual, there are limits, and there are outliers. So by gradual, I mean that agriculture in the Fertile Crescent was first exploited 11,000 years ago, but there was no civilization 11,000 years ago that had 10 million agents. These were small, little, complex villages of maybe 1,000 to 10,000 individuals. It took quite a great degree of intensification to get up to the level of 10 to 100 million agents, but there's a limit, so there's a plateau to it. You can't get any more than this. And that's related to net primary productivity, which is a term referring to how much energy you can get from the biosphere with just agriculture alone. So basically, you can only stabilize a system with so many agents when you're just relying on agriculture, when you're just relying on the domestication of plants and animals. You need a new energy source to get higher than this, to get a system with more agents to control that many individuals. So the outlier with this is the Mongols have been estimated to have 110 million agents in their system, but they were a very unstable entity, and they weren't even really an agricultural civilization. They really just exploited a bunch of other agricultural cores. So they're cheating in a sense. And then the Spanish and the Portuguese had obviously an intercontinental empire, so they spanned more than a continent. But again, their administration of these regions was quite weak. They didn't have the communication mechanism really to do it, or the energy to do it. And as a result of that, decolonization happened there quite quickly. But I'll talk about it maybe more if there are any questions. And then, so the next one with industry, there's one independent center. I'm going to be talking more about the timing and diffusion of these things after, but it's important that there's only one center of the Industrial Revolution as opposed to the 7 that were in the Agricultural Revolution. The center was England in between 1750 and 1800, and for the first time we're exploiting energy that's not extant. We're exploiting basically the old biosphere resources from the old biosphere: coal, oil, natural gas. Later on, nuclear, hydro. Renewables are always a marginal portion of this. We'll talk about that. And I guess one of the interesting things I want to mention is the system level pattern. So with hunting and agriculture, of course, other species have had those transitions in a sense. Other animals have exploited hunting. They haven't done it with a technocultural pathway. They did it with a biochemical pathway, and with agriculture, the same thing. They exploited agriculture with a biochemical pathway, not a technocultural pathway. But this is the first time in the history of life that basically fossil fuels were exploited by a species, and a tremendous amount of new energy was released as a result of that. into our system. And then the diffusion was more based on the colonial power or sovereignty of the region that exploited this power source. But it diffused quite quickly once each area of the planet acquired their own sovereignty, and it's still a process that's occurring. But it's occurred over the scale of centuries, and I guess this is what I also wanted to mention with the system level pattern is with the agricultural transition, it occurred over the scale of thousands of years. This one's occurring on a much faster scale, the diffusion of it. So the communication with this one is printing press. Of course, it emerges before industry is exploited, which is something I'll talk about more later. But essentially, you get mass communication and a restructuring of society with the emergence of the printing press. And industrial scale printing doesn't really commence until the 19th century. You get a change in the way the printing press is done, the way information is transferred and released into the system. You get global diffusion of it. And basically this, it makes writing and knowledge and information that's written in this form, it's no longer such an elite privilege. Anyone can have writing, anyone can have this type of information and access to it. And it's the first one-to-many medium, so I write and an infinite number of people can potentially read this. And the causative effects. You get the Renaissance, scientific revolutions, the Enlightenment, etc. So now, this is something I think is important for these transitions, is a focus on the decrease of the timing and the increase of the diffusion. So the timing between them decreases from 2 million to 200,000 years. That's quite a long time for it to mature as a transition. Agriculture takes, again, substantially less time, but still a long amount of time, thousands of years. And the reason I have it at 2000 CE as the time it's really ending is because there are still hunter-gatherers around in the 20th century. The system had not completely transferred over to everyone in the agricultural system. Really, the only hunter-gatherers left on the planet are hunter-gatherers that we've sort of chosen to leave them in that state. It's for their best good and it's for our best good, I suppose. I mean, just let them be, because there could be a number of negative consequences with bringing them into the agricultural system. It might be a complete shock. There might be a number of diseases they're not immune to. They might have trouble adjusting to our society, etc. But for the most part, it's over. And then the industrial transition is still ongoing. But it's diffused quite quickly, and I would hypothesize that it's almost over. It's sort of run its course, and it's operating on the scale of centuries, so the timing of these things keeps decreasing. And then the diffusion, start and end of them, increases. So the diffusion of them took about hundreds of thousands of years for the first one, tens of thousands of years for the second one, and only hundreds of years for this one. And then the focus I want to discuss is that these act essentially as restructuring mechanisms for society. So with hunting and language, we get the emergence of everything you consider human. By science, what I mean is that with language, you can start to basically try and explain your world. You can start to ask questions. You get an explanatory framework for your world. This is really the most primitive aspect of science to me. With religion, what I mean by that, the most primitive aspect of religion would be the concept that you're going to die, and so you would get some sort of worship of something more than yourself, something beyond yourself. You're conscious and you don't want to die. And we start to see, definitely with Homo neanderthalensis and Homo heidelbergensis, where you get burials, you get things that you could be interpreted as supernatural rituals of some kind, things you don't really see with chimpanzees. They don't really understand that they're going to die. You also get things like medicine. Again, chimpanzees, you could say they have some type of medicine, but this seems to be more systematic, more culturally dependent, more faithfully transmitted over time. And important thing is symbolic relationships. So you're not just a pair bond anymore, but you're a marriage. You have language. You can codify this relationship. And again, complex technoculture. So all this stuff emerges with this transition. And all of these phenomena are centered around the individual or the small group. With agriculture, so you get all of these things that emerge that we think of as human, and you get them centralized in institutions. So politics gets centralized, marriage gets institutionalized, religion gets institutionalized. I feel like because of science's nature, it couldn't really have its own institutions during this revolution. It's sort of whatever the political or religious figures of the state feel is what is believed about nature. So essentially, they're all run through these institutions. They're all run through chiefdoms and monarchies, or the equivalents of chiefdoms and monarchies. And the degree of central, this is something I wanted to talk about as another presentation I made, but it was basically trying to take the idea of challenge propagation and sort of arguing that we can actually quantify how intelligent these institutions are based on the structure of their centralization or decentralization. With the Industrial Revolution and the printing press, you get a shift towards greater decentralization. You get a shift from religious bloodlines to democratically elected career politicians, which of course they're more accountable to the people. They have to care about the people to a greater degree. They're not to the degree we would like, but still more than a king or a pharaoh who doesn't have to care about you at all, and can basically do whatever he wants. As an example, like the King of Spain could just go attack England if he wanted to attack England. Barack Obama can't just go and attack England if he feels like he wants to attack England. He's accountable to more people. In the Industrial Revolution, religion gets separated from other institutions. So you have to stay out of politics. Science and medicine get their own institutions. Religion's not a part of this. They get excluded in a sense. Science and medicine get established and diffuse as their own institutions. And marriage gradually gets detached from religion. What I want to focus on and explain with this one for what I'm going to talk about soon is that with agriculture, marriage is completely centralized in the sense that on the individual level, the male controls it. Then whoever the man is, the woman has very little say in who she marries in that sense, and the state basically controls the fact that you should be monogamous in a sense. And then with the Industrial Revolution, it slowly gets decentralized in a sense that the woman now has rights or starts to get rights and can have more of a say of what she would like in the marriage agreement. So that's what I mean by essentially it's becoming a little more decentralized. There's two people who have say in the marriage itself, in the bond. And then the important thing is you get the birth of individual rights with the Enlightenment. I think with printing press, the idea that individuals should have rights over the collective. And so then I want to talk about the next transition. So I feel like over the last 100 years, different scholars in different fields have sort of thought about different things related to what the next transition could be. These ideas share several themes, several commonalities. It's been called a number of things: technological singularity, global brain, great transition, world brain, etc., new sphere. One of the things they share in all of these ideas is that there's something big in the near future that's going to happen. And it's usually imagined as global or collective or planetary. Oftentimes it's viewed as generally positive. Some people view it as negative, like robot uprising of some kind or something like that. But in all of these major thoughts about it and people who have written about it, it's generally perceived to be a positive thing, a very positive transition in the future. And sometimes it's viewed as a new stage of evolution, like a new transition, perhaps, of some kind, a new species or a new type of entity emerging. And it usually includes advanced intelligence, more advanced intelligence that exists today. So I feel like in this framework we can sort of see and get a glimpse of what the transition might be and what it might be like in terms of the things we're discussing with energy, communication, and transportation. With energy, I think it's going to be based on solar. I think there's a lot of good evidence that solar is the industry that's maturing at the fastest pace, that has the most potential to exploit new energy. Other people have disagreed with me. They think it could be a combination of a number of things, including geothermal and nuclear fusion or wind. Undoubtedly, there's going to be several fuel sources that are exploited, but the importance is that we're very close to getting rid of the fossil fuel industry and transitioning to a new industry. Not only do we have to do this, but the technologies to do it are maturing at a rapid pace. We could actually predict when these new systems will emerge and stabilize and give us more energy and cleaner energy. And of course, the communication medium is the internet at full maturity right now. Not everyone's on the internet. About 2 to 2.4 billion people are on the internet. But at the pace at which people are coming onto the internet is a rapid pace. I think it was something like 500 million people in the year 2000 were on the internet on a regular basis. Now 2.4 billion, this is a massive increase. By most estimates I've read that in the 2020s, everyone will basically be on the internet. There are a lot of global projects that are emerging to make sure that everyone has internet access all the time. This is a new communication medium in a sense. And to stabilize what I feel is a new level of order again. With transportation, what we should expect after this occurs, after we release new energy into the system, and once we have a new communication medium that everyone is interacting on all the time, we should be able to form more of a global civilization in the framework. This would be in accordance with the leveling up of transportation that we've seen with every other transition. And it should include 10 to 12 billion agents. So this is again an increase from the industrial period where you have networks of 1 to 2 billion people. We have countries like China and India that are today including billions of people. In the next transportation revolution, it should be everyone in the same system, which would be, again, a leveling up of agents. It's estimated, the UN has estimated in between 9 and 10 billion people will be on the planet by 2050, so that's where I'm sort of saying 10 to 12 billion. Mechanisms for this, again, I feel like the transportation mechanisms for a truly global transportation grid won't come until after the transition has occurred. One such mechanism that's sort of only theoretical at the moment is the Hyperloop, if anyone's seen Elon Musk's design for the Hyperloop. It's a transportation mechanism that would basically make where you are on a continent irrelevant. You'd be able to get from San Francisco to New York in less than an hour and for like $20. He's building the prototype for this now.
How does it work?
The Hyperloop, it's basically, from what I understand, it's more of like utilizing magnets in the same way that the magnetic trains in Japan are, except it's in a tube and it's just flying like frictionless in a frictionless magnetic environment. And in his design, he's basing this off of solar power. He wants this to be powered by solar. My point with this transportation example is that what I think we're all increasingly recognizing, at least I've recognized, is that the internet makes our transportation grid look archaic. I mean, it was a massive increase it was a massive improvement in the Industrial Revolution. We have, of course, the continental mechanism would be automobiles, an automobile industry. The intercontinental mechanism would be airplanes or steam-powered ships in the 19th century. But these things are out of date. The internet makes them out of date, really. It makes them look archaic and silly. I've got a whole bunch of friends that I know just from collaborating on the internet that I can't ever meet in real life because the transportation mechanisms are too cumbersome. What will happen is there'll be increased, the new energy will allow for a new transportation grid, but there will also just be a selective pressure for a new transportation grid. We'll need, like I say, the continental mechanism could be something like the Hyperloop. I don't know what the intercontinental mechanism could be, but I shouldn't expect it to be a prototype technology at the moment because the transportation mechanisms always come after the new energy, never before it. But I suspect it'll come. We can't have a situation where our communication mechanism literally erases geography and we don't have the analogous transportation mechanisms to help us get around the planet more efficiently and better. And then in terms of the emergence, we should expect it to continue on this exponential doubling time, or if it does continue on this exponential doubling time, it should happen in the 2040s to the 2050s. When I read about so like based on the rate at which the previous transitions have occurred, the next one should occur this century. It should occur in the middle of this century. But based on also the the forecasts for new energy, and what I mean by that is, when will solar reach grid parity with fossil fuels? After solar has reached grid parity with fossil fuels, there should be a few countries that adopt it. Germany will probably be one of the first. They've already transitioned quite a ways away from fossil fuels and towards solar. Whatever country ends up doing it, I would suspect it'll be like a cascading effect. They'll have just so much more energy than the rest of the world, and it'll be so much cleaner and obviously beneficial. It should just sort of be rolling. All countries start to transition to the new form of energy. And based on when it reaches grid parity with oil, this could happen soon. It could happen in the 2030s, or it could happen in the 2040s. But when it does happen, our society will be completely restructured by the new energy that's released into the system. And then again, that timing would be sort of in line with forecasts on when everyone will be on the internet. Like, when are all 7 billion of us going to be on the internet all the time? Wouldn't be far off if we expected that to occur in the 2030s or the 2040s. So it's not that far off, and the diffusion of it should be quick. Again, the diffusion of these things is decreasing. The industrial transition only took centuries. The agricultural one took thousands of years. This one should probably just take a decade or two. The organization of the system will be much, much better. And we'll have, with this transition, we'll have solved a lot of the problems that we're constantly inundated with, especially related to global warming. I almost feel like the fear-mongering about global warming is maybe a functional tool to get us to transition to new energy quicker. And it's doing a good job of that, because I think we're on our way. So now the restructuring, and really I could have done a whole presentation on the restructuring. I don't think I really talked about it in the detail that it should be. But I feel like with politics, we've gone from, in the agricultural revolution, something that's highly centralized. All the agricultural systems were highly centralized among a few people, one person. With the industrial transition, we got completely new political institutions. Right after the Industrial Revolution, we got things like the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the new, what we would consider modern states. I feel like after the next transition, we should get, again, much better political systems that make much better decisions much quicker. I think what the internet's also making us realize with politics is that we collectively make decisions much better than do the political institutions that we have to put up with. I think a great example of this would be with something like gay marriage in the United States, where everyone in the United States, or the majority of people in the United States, collectively realized that gay marriage was fine, well before the political institutions decided, okay, well, we'll eventually concede to what you guys think. But the point is that if you had distributed voting, these decisions could be made very quickly, very easily, and more justly. With religion, I feel like the institution itself will, because it's so centralized in its nature, it can't possibly exist in this new information structure. It'll have to be, I'm not saying spirituality or religious belief will necessarily go away. We have an evolved sort of need for spiritual belief in these things, but the institutions themselves will become functionless. They've already been sort of marginalized from all of our other institutions, and I feel like if we have distributed voting, things like let me back up. So what I think like the religious structures that are in our society today, it's an illusion that they're stable. Why it's an illusion that they're stable is because they get incredible amounts of tax subsidies and they don't pay taxes on their land. I feel like if we had distributed voting in the 2040s, most people who probably don't even use these institutions, they don't actually go to church, regardless of whether they believe in God or not, if they don't go to church, will all vote that they shouldn't get those tax subsidies, they should have to pay taxes on their land. And that's sort of like pulling the leg from underneath them. The institutions will just sort of collapse and become like museums or something. But no one will be going to these things, on top of the fact that everyone will have so much knowledge. And you'll have all world knowledge basically in your brain if you're always on the internet all the time. And you'll have technology. I haven't talked about technology of the global brain, but this has been talked about by other people. If you have everyone on the planet with all the knowledge, or a lot of the knowledge, it would be very hard for religion to stay stable. It preys on the ignorance of people and the poverty of people, also the poverty of people, right? And there's going to be a ton of more energy in the system, so it's going to lose its base, the people it preys on. So I feel like we can actually predict when it will fall and crumble and how it will fall and crumble. But there will still be spirituality. There will still be spiritual belief. I'm sure it will manifest in new and different forms. I'm sure it's not going away. I think humanism or transhumanism will form a real base of a new type of spiritual belief. But it could manifest in different forms as well. I guess that at the end of the day, my message with this is that there just won't be these institutions that people can go to every week and be brainwashed. Like, they won't exist anymore. And then with science and university, I don't think that universities will need to be teaching institutions. I feel like that's already they're losing their function in that sense. There's so many different online versions of these technologies that allow teaching on mass scales to potentially millions of people at the same time, that going to one location to be taught by one professor in a room of 100 people starts to look increasingly silly. But they will be research institutions, that the institutions themselves might still be necessary and functional. But of course, there may not be the same political centers to fund them. If politics transitions into a more decentralized form where it's everyone making these decisions collectively, it may be something like crowdsourcing campaign sites that already exist, like or that are in their infancy right now, like a MicroRiza, where you're funded directly by the public. There are a lot of advantages to this, and it could mature over time and to become something that it's not at the moment. But one of the examples, what they're talking about at MicroRiza, is that as a researcher, you're sort of tied to whatever political entity is funding your research. In the future, it could be more that you have a more direct relationship to the public, and it might be much easier to find people that are interested in the work you do and might be more inclined to fund you directly. So sort of like you would build a follower base. So if you proposed a research study and you found 25 people on social media and social online networking to fund your research, they become your followers now. And so you have to build a rapport with these people over time, and you build up your follower base of people who enjoy your research and want to fund your research. Oh, I really like research on transhumanism, or I really like learning more about ancient Egypt or ancient Rome. I like the stuff you're doing. I'll follow you. I'll contribute $100 to you every year to keep doing your research, etc. And we'll have more energy, and it'll be more of a crowdfunding culture as well. Like, this might seem strange now, but the crowdfunding culture has just started. It's only 5 years old, really. And it's going to only grow larger and larger. And right now, the crowdfunding culture is filled by people of my age group who don't have money. But in the 2040s and the 2050s, we'll have more money. We'll be able to support this culture more broadly. There'll be more energy in the system as well. So there'll be individuals. Everyone will have a better education. Everyone will have a little bit more of an expendable income, and we'll be able to direct culture how we would like to direct culture a lot more. Right now, culture and research is directed by centralized political entities that don't necessarily always reflect what the people want or what the people think is good research, or what, that's a problem that's going on in Canada and America right now that I can speak on directly. Certain research just doesn't get funded. It doesn't matter if we think it's useful or if we think it's interesting. We're sort of at the whim of whoever gets elected to these political boards. So you would have more freedom in a sense, because you could easily find people who enjoy what you do and build up a rapport and a trust with these people. And you'd get to keep them. You get their followers and you keep them over decades and decades and decades, and they become your supporters. They get emailed every time you have a new research project or something like that. It'll be app in your brain for this. So marriage and sex, I wanted to talk about. I didn't feel like I talked about it very much, but basically we got increased pair bonds with hunting. The reason why we got increased pair bonds with hunting is because our brain size increased. So we needed more time. It became increasingly beneficial to have two parents raising offspring when you had offspring that needed 7 to 10 years, 15 years to be raised. Chimpanzees don't really pair bond because their offspring mature, they're weaned by 3 or 4, and then they're off and they're building their own little sticks and doing their own thing. But with larger brain size and language, it takes 10 years, 15 years really for a human to mature and grow, and you have increased pair bonding. Evidence for this increased pair bonding is that our sexual dimorphism decreased. So in primatological literature, it's pretty strong correlation that the less dimorphic your males and females, the more monogamous they are. The reason, and the more dimorphic they are, like gorillas, for example, are a great example of this. Gorillas are species where the males are massively larger than the females. This is because they harem build. They just compete with the other males, and whoever wins in this competition gets basically all the females, and they build their harem, and then the males that lose are just left to a life of solitary life by themselves, and it's very sad. But with humans, we can expect that there was increased pair bonding. We do have a biochemical need to pair bond. We're not completely monogamous. This was not complete monogamy, but it was just increased pair bonding. Then with agricultural revolution, we take this phenomenon, it's symbolic, we symbolize it with marriage. In all agricultural civilizations, there's some patriarchy that emerges where there's very strong pair bonding. That's institutionalized. You should do this. It's culturally right, it's clean to be with one person, etc., like that. Religions really play on this. Again, in the Industrial Revolution, we have a decentralization of this where the female also has control over the marriage, who she marries, if she would like to stay in the marriage or not. This was not a choice that was available in the Agricultural Revolution. And then as we get closer to the global brain transition, I feel like first, no institution will have any investment in your pair bond. There'll be like in the agriculture, it would be religion that you would have to go and codify and codify your pair bond. More today, it would be that the state recognizes your pair bond. There won't be any of this. There'll be no institution that has any interest. They'll know as much about your pair bond as they know about your friendships. Essentially, that's what I feel is going to happen. And what I mean by a complete decentralization of sex is that it's going to be something completely different. There'll be lots of different types of sexual partnerships. There will still be pair bonds. There'll be other types of partnerships as well, though. And sex might completely be something different. It will depend on 3 things, I feel. It'll depend on how long our lives are. Our lives could be much longer. It will depend on whether we keep having kids. That will also depend on how long we live. Again, this requires a lot more time to explain, but and then it will depend on whether we keep having biological sex. So all of those things are the 3 things that will determine what marriage looks like and what sex is like in a global brain-like world. Right now, the trends, though, are towards marriage keeps getting pushed back in age. People in my generation are just not getting married, sometimes choosing not to get married at all. Sometimes they'll get married in their 30s. This trend should continue. People in my generation are also not having children very often, and the birth rate in developed countries just drops, and it's just going to keep dropping, I feel. And again, but it will be dependent on how long our lives are extended. If our lives are extended to, like Google and Apple are now really focused on beating aging, defeating aging, and they've come up, there's labs all across America right now where they're focused on extending our lives by, their goals are 20, 30, 40 years. If something like this occurs in the near future where we just get through stem cells or through nanotechnology, lives that are, where we're regularly living to 120 or regularly living to 140, kids that are born into this environment just won't be, we didn't evolve to pair bond for hundreds of years. We evolved to pair bond for 7 years and 10 years. This was the evolved function of the pair bond. It was to raise the kid for 7 to 10 years. If we're living to 140, if we're living to 150, we're just not going to pair bond in the same way. It's going to completely change. So I expect that to happen. Either way, it'll become completely decentralized. It could be that biological sex is on the process of being completely wiped out as well. It could be that the new sex is idea sex, that we just enjoy sharing our ideas more than we like sharing our gametes, right? And this could be the future of sex. It could just be that, Ben Goertzel's talked about mind spheres, that when we're all on the internet all the time and when the internet's in our brains, we're just going to throw our minds together essentially and merge our minds, and that will be much more, and that will be much more enriched. That would really be the decentralization of sex, though. That would be that this is an essentially group sex. In the global brain, this would be massively different. We would have all our minds merged. I wouldn't have to give this presentation. I could just share my brain pattern with you, and that would be incredibly stimulating. And if you could do the same with me, that would be incredibly stimulating for me. That could be the future of sex. Either way, it's going to be very different. I feel that's where I think it's going.
That's the nerdish version of sex.
Pardon?
The nerdish version.
No, I think it's more fundamental, because if really evolution is about memes today.
Yeah, evolution is about memes. And okay, so another interesting thing, but why people aren't getting
sex does not only have the function of reproduction. I mean,
not just of course it's not just we're hypersexual. We're going to keep having sex in new and different ways. Before the global brain, what I mean by decentralization of sex is that we're going to have lots of sex, and in new forms. As soon as we get new technology, we use it for sex. The internet is mostly just porn, right? Not mostly just porn, but it's a lot of just porn. But
depends what's your definition of sex, because if you're thinking on the center of pleasure activating, as you see, there are a lot of other ways of making it activated. Yeah.
Right, and you can take sex as biological sex, and I think sharing ideas is a form of sex. I mean, you sit down with someone and you're sharing interesting ideas with them, or your two mimetic spheres really get along really well. It's an enjoyable experience. It's a really stimulating experience. You could see this becoming intensified even further. And what I mean by people in my generation increasingly opting to just not have kids and to maybe not get married, it could just be connected to the idea that it's just becoming more exciting now to build a cultural legacy for yourself instead of a biological legacy for yourself, right? Like in the agricultural world, your legacy would be your genes. And this was in the culture. You pass on your genes, pass on your name. This was incredible prestige in this. It was a goal for a lot of people to make sure they have their kids pass on their name, pass on their legacy. And it could just be that we're transferring more and more to caring about if our ideas are going to be around in centuries to come. That's what we want to leave behind. It could be that that's the direction it's going. I think it is. And then in this, if this is right, if this whole theory is sound, then we would have this energy communication feedback loop with hunting language, agricultural writing, industry, printing press, solar, and internet. And there's an interesting relationship between these I wanted to talk about. So, for example, obviously, what we have here, I've got this right. So the printing press came well before industry. And at the moment as it stands, the internet's come before the full maturation of solar. But then we have the reverse happening in the first two, where it seems like hunting came before language and agriculture came before writing. But I've been reading, there was new research just this year that showed that very primitive types of writing could have emerged before sedentary agriculture, and that it just wasn't recorded in a form that's remained. So what we're seeing is writing after thousands of years of it having being existed, but it just didn't preserve well. And there's now just evidence to support this. So there's a research team this year that was doing research 11,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, and they stumbled upon this very flimsy type of structure that's dated to 11,000 years ago, and there's symbols on the wall. right? So this could be the most primitive type of writing system where they're extending their minds and recording something. Who knows what they're recording? It's still not shown, but it could be that the communication always predates the energy. I don't think we have enough evidence to say one way or the other for writing in agriculture, hunting, and language, but it's certainly the case for industry and printing press and solar and internet, if this is right. And then so for the transportation, you go from regional, continental, intercontinental to global. 250 to 100 million as the most, 2 billion is the most in the industrial, and then potentially again to 12 billion. And then the timing and diffusion being exponential. So then a few questions is, does this close a human metasystem feedback loop in a sense? So the way I'm picturing it in my head is that hunting gives us big brains. Agriculture lets us use these big brains for things unrelated to hunting, so we can be philosophers, historians, politicians. We can start using mimetic information much more. Then with industry, we can basically fill up our brains, and all of the institutions that arose during the agricultural revolution are essentially reaching their full maturation during the Industrial Revolution, and so that sort of closes the feedback loop. And what happens after that, I don't know. So what closes it would be something like you were talking about in your last paper, where you imagine this world where everyone basically has the equivalent of a PhD worth of knowledge with with significant understanding of most other fields, just because of the amount of information transferred in the system. Well, I would go just even a little step further than that and say, what if we have this type of situation in the global brain where we have these brain interface devices where you're on the internet all the time, and you basically have the ability to access the information in the cloud, and you have something, the equivalent of a smartphone device where you're talking to Watson all the time, which has all the information. So basically all the agents in the system have all the human knowledge that's ever been made at one time. So this is sort of like the feedback loop closing, in a sense that, okay, all the agents now have all the information in the system, and so what happens after that type of thing?
You mean the feedback loop between the different humans?
Like, does that usher us into a post-human world, in a sense? Like, does this, yeah?
Yeah, that's an interesting observation also that I made. It's that in multicellular organisms, you have also all the information which is in every part, in every cell.
Right.
So there is an analogy here, but I don't know what to make of
Yeah,
it.
I don't know what to make of it either. Just a question. Like, could this indicate that, like that this is sort of like the hunting ushered in humans, and then that this global brain is going to usher in some post-humanity, some other entity is going to exist, maybe technological in nature. And then will higher consciousness emerge? Will the global brain itself be conscious, or will we be forming some higher consciousness, sort of like Ben Goertzel's ideas of mind spheres, where you get sort of meta consciousnesses, where you're merging different brains, and that merger between different brains forms some higher consciousness that is has its own self-awareness. I think all of those are possibilities. And will higher systems level reproduction emerge? This would sort of be like I guess Pierre Thiel Chardin's idea of the new sphere just reproducing, creating a new spheres. So this would like be planetary reproduction. So like the global brain. So like one of the problems with getting to Mars, for example, is that we can't take our system with us. So like we leave our system and then we have trouble setting up a new system on Mars. With the global brain, would we be solving that problem by just being able to reproduce our system and just going to the new system on Mars, taking our system with us? This would sort of be like global brain reproduction in a sense. And then we'd have two global brains in the same solar system, and we could, it was someone one of the co-creators of the internet. He was talking about how one of his goals before he dies is to have to establish some sort of interstellar internet communication. This could be done with Mars, presumably, and that we could have some sort of two-planet network that's communicating. This would be perhaps another system transition of some kind. And then will this be a post-human era? We keep on merging with our technology more and more intimately. Our computers keep getting smaller and smaller, more intimate. We're interacting on them more and more. Will our computers eventually just go into our bodies? Will they just start? Will our technology just start doing things, and will we start just making technology that does what our cells do, only more effectively? And will this change the species? Will this be a different type of species living in the global brain? I think all questions to talk about and discuss. And that's it. And then the works cited. You guys, I know this is going online, and then you can look through the works cited. So I don't know if there are any questions or any.